Captain Marcus Cole never wanted to be a diplomat, and he certainly never expected to stand in the crystal throne hall of the most powerful alien empire in the known galaxy. He was a cargo hauler, nothing more and nothing less. A man who spent his days moving grain and machine parts between space stations and colonies across the outer rim of human territory. But fate had other plans for him. The real diplomats from Earth were stuck 3 weeks away with a broken faster-than-light drive, and humanity needed someone to represent them at the centennial gathering of the Galactic Concordat. Someone meant anyone, and anyone meant Marcus. So here he stood in his borrowed formal jacket that did not fit quite right, surrounded by over 200 alien dignitaries from 37 different species, all of whom looked at him like he was a small insect that had wandered into their important meeting. The Vethkari were the hosts of this grand event, and they were truly terrifying to behold. Each one stood about 7 feet tall with shimmering shells that changed color in the light, and they had 4 arms and eyes as black as the deepest parts of space. They had conquered 11 star systems before most species in this room had figured out how to make Firefly's Reithvan sat upon her throne made of living crystal that hummed with strange energy, and her presence filled the entire hall with a cold and heavy feeling that pressed down on everyone present. She had barely looked at Marcus when he was announced to the gathering. The herald had called out his name and title, and the queen had simply flicked one of her antennae in his direction. Before returning her attention to more important matters, Marcus did not blame her for this treatment, because in galactic terms, humanity was like a baby who had just learned to crawl while everyone else in the room had been walking for thousands of years. Humans had only discovered how to travel faster than light 43 years ago, and that made them the youngest species at this gathering by far. So Marcus kept to the edges of the Great Hall, and he held a drink that tasted absolutely terrible, and he watched the political games unfold before him. Like a play he did not understand, the various alien species were discussing trade routes and border disputes and military alliances, and Marcus could only catch about 1 word in 10 of what they were saying. Then something caught his attention, and his eyes were drawn to a small figure near one of the massive pillars. It was a child. She was small by Vethkari standards, maybe 4 feet tall, and her shell was softer looking and pale blue in color, which Marcus had read meant she was young. This was Princess Kethany, the only daughter of the queen and heir to the entire Vethkari empire. She stood near a group of Dromulan ambassadors who towered over her like mountains made of gray flesh and muscle. The Dromulans were huge creatures, nearly 9 feet tall, and they were known throughout the galaxy for their aggressive expansion and their love of intimidation. They were not talking to the princess in a friendly way. They were talking at her, their words cold and sharp, even through the translator devices that turned their rumbling speech into something Marcus could understand. Your mother pushes into the periphery systems, and this threatens the balance of power, one of them said with a voice like grinding rocks. Perhaps the young princess could convince her mother to see reason before something unfortunate happens. It was a threat, and Marcus had heard enough threats in his life to recognize one when he heard it. The princess had her antennae pressed flat against her head, and Marcus remembered from his cultural briefing that this meant fear. Her 4 small hands were clasped tightly together, and she seemed to be trying to make herself even smaller than she already was. None of the other dignitaries in the hall did anything to help her. The queen watched from her throne with an expression that revealed nothing, and she made no move to rescue her daughter from this situation. Perhaps it was a test of some kind, or perhaps it was simply the Vethkari way, where strength had to be proven and could never be given as a gift. Marcus looked away and told himself that this was not his problem. He was here to smile and nod and not cause any trouble that might hurt relations between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. The Dromulan ambassador reached out and placed one massive gray hand on the princess's small shoulder, and she flinched like she had been struck. "This is not your business," Marcus told himself again as he watched the scene unfold. The ambassador's grip tightened, and the princess let out a small sound of distress that she quickly tried to hide. Marcus set down his terrible drink. Something inside him shifted. Something old and deep and very human. Something that did not care about politics or protocols or the careful balance of interstellar relations. He started walked directly through a conversation between two very important-looking aliens. And both of them jumped back in shock at his rudeness. He did not care. He walked past a group of tall, thin creatures with too many eyes who hissed at him in disapproval. He did not stop. He approached the Dromulan cluster with the steady walk of a man who had once crossed a cargo bay that was losing air just to reach the emergency controls. The lead Dromulan ambassador was a creature called Vareth, and he turned slowly to look at this small human who dared to approach. "Excuse me," Marcus said, and his voice carried in the sudden silence that had started to spread through the hall like ripples in water. "I do not believe the princess is comfortable with this conversation." Vareth stepped forward until he loomed over Marcus, using his massive size to intimidate as his species always did. "The human speaks out of turn," Vareth rumbled, and the sound made Marcus's teeth hurt. "Return to your corner, infant species, because this does not concern you." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, and he was surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "But I'm making it concern me." The entire hall had gone completely silent now. Every single alien in the room was watching this strange scene unfold. Even the queen had leaned forward on her throne with something that might have been interest in her dark eyes. Princess Cathani stared up at Marcus with those black eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies within them. She looked at him like she had never seen anything quite like him before. Vareth spoke again in his own language without using the translator, a deliberate insult that meant Marcus was not worth the effort of communication. The other Dromulans laughed, and the sound was like boulders crashing together. Marcus did not move from where he stood. Had faced down pirates in the asteroid belt, and he had negotiated with criminal cartels on the frozen moon of Europa, and he had once spent 6 hours talking a desperate man out of killing himself and 30 passengers. A Dromulan diplomat was honestly not the scariest thing he had ever faced. "I am going to stand here," Marcus said in a voice that was calm and clear, "until this conversation is over and the princess is free to leave whenever she wants." Vareth's massive hand rose up as if to strike, and then the princess ran. She did not run away from the confrontation. She did not run toward her mother on the throne. She ran behind Marcus and grabbed the back of his jacket with all 4 of her small hands and pressed herself against him like he was a wall that could protect her from everything bad in the universe. The hall did not just go quiet. It went completely frozen. Marcus could feel 200 pairs of alien eyes staring at him with shock and confusion, and something he could not quite name. He could feel the small princess trembling against his back, and her grip on his jacket was fierce and desperate. He had just broken every rule of diplomacy that exists today. Princess of the most powerful empire in the galaxy had just chosen a human as her protector. The silence stretched on, and Marcus stood there with a frightened alien child hiding behind him and wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. The silence in the crystal throne hall was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. 200 alien dignitaries from 37 different species stood frozen in place, and every single one of them was staring at the impossible scene before them. A human, a member of the youngest and weakest spacefaring species in the known galaxy, stood in the middle of the hall with the heir to the Vethkari Empire hiding behind him like he was some kind of shield against the universe. Princess Cathani had not loosened her grip on his jacket, even slightly, and Marcus could feel her small body pressed against his back. Trembling, but no longer shaking as badly as before, Ambassador Vareth still had his massive hand raised, and his gray face showed an expression that Marcus could not read. but suspected was some mixture of shock and fury. Then Queen Sirith Von rose. From her throne, the movement was slow and deliberate and carried more weight than any words could possibly convey. The crystal beneath her feet sang out a single clear note that echoed through the hall, and every Vethkari in the room immediately bowed their heads in response. The queen descended the steps of her raised platform, and the crowd parted before her like water flowing around a stone. Every step she took seemed to make the air heavier, and Marcus found it hard to breathe as she approached. He did not bow because he was not sure what the proper way to show respect was, and more importantly, he was not going to move while a frightened child was using him as protection against her fears. The queen stopped about 3 feet away from where Marcus stood. This close, he could see that her eyes were not simply black, but were filled with swirling patterns that moved and shifted like galaxies spinning in the darkness of space. She was beautiful and terrible and ancient in ways that Marcus could not begin to understand. "You have created an incident human," she said, and her voice was translated, but something of its original complexity came through in layers of meaning that Marcus could only partly grasp. "Yes, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, and he was proud that his voice did not shake. "I apologize for the disruption to your gathering. Do you understand what my daughter has done?" The queen asked, and her antennae moved in patterns that Marcus could not interpret. Marcus felt Cathani's grip tighten on his jacket in response to her mother's words. "She found somewhere she felt safe," he said simply. "I do not think that requires understanding because it just requires respect." A murmur ran through the assembled aliens like wind moving through tall grass. Several translator devices buzzed with overlapping commentary as different species discussed what they were. Witnessing the queen's antennae shifted again in that unreadable pattern. In 10,000 years of Vethkari history, no heir to the throne has ever sought protection from an outsider, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast hall. "It is unprecedented in every way. I am sorry if I have caused offense." Marcus began to say, "You misunderstand." The queen interrupted, and her head tilted slightly to one side as she studied him. "Among my people, children do not choose. They're protectors because their instincts choose for them instead." She paused, and the silence in the hall grew even deeper if that was possible. "The young see what adults have learned to ignore over time," she continued. "They see the truth of a being's nature without the filters that experience and politics place over our eyes." The queen turned to address the entire hall, and her voice rang out clear and strong. "My daughter looked upon this room," she declared. "She looked upon the assembled might of 37 species and upon warriors and conquerors and kings who have ruled their domains for thousands of years." She turned back to face Marcus, and her dark eyes held his, and her instinct chose the human. The murmuring grew louder as aliens throughout the hall processed this information. Marcus saw expressions changing on faces that he barely understood, and he saw confusion and reassessment and something that might have been the beginning of genuine interest in the humans who had seemed so unimportant before Varath of the Dromulan hegemony. The queen said, and her attention snapped to the massive ambassador who still stood with his hand partially raised. "You sought to intimidate my child in order to send a message to me." Varath lowered his hand slowly and stood very still like a prey animal that has suddenly realized a predator is watching. "The message I have received is this," the queen continued, and her voice was cold as the void between stars. "Your species threatens children while mine protects them." She paused, and the weight of her words seemed to press down on everyone in the room, as it seems do the humans. Varath opened his mouth to speak, but the queen silenced him with a single gesture of one of her 4 hands. "Captain Cole," she said, and her attention returned to Marcus. "My daughter still holds to you, and she will not release you until she feels safe, because this is the way of our young." Marcus could feel the truth of her words in the grip that showed no signs of loosening. This tells me that you are worthy of trust." The queen continued, "Will you stand as her guardian for the remainder of this gathering?" Marcus thought about what she was asking. He was not a diplomat, and he had no training for situations like this. He was not a warrior, and he had no way to protect the princess from the kind of threats that existed in the world of galactic politics. He was just a cargo hauler who moved things from one place to another for a living. But there was a frightened child holding on to him like he was the only safe thing in her world, and that fact mattered more than all of his doubts. "Your Majesty," he said slowly and carefully, "I am not a diplomat, and I am not a warrior, and I haul cargo for a living. And yet here you stand." The queen replied. Marcus let out a breath that he had not realized he was holding. "Yeah," he said, "I guess I do." He reached back carefully and slowly so as not to startle her, and he took one of Cathani's small hands in his own. Her shell was smooth and warm against his palm like stone that had been sitting in the sun. "Okay, kid," he said softly so that only she could hear. "Looks like you are stuck with me for a while." Her grip on his jacket tightened even more, but this time it did not feel like fear. Her antennae rose up from their flattened position against her head to stand tall and alert, and for the first time since Marcus had noticed her standing with the Dromulans, the young Princess Cathani of the Vethkari Empire smiled. It was a strange expression on her alien face, but Marcus understood it perfectly. The queen watched this exchange with eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "The gathering will resume," she announced to the hall. "Captain Cole will remain at my daughter's side, and he will be accorded the respect due to a guardian of the royal family." She turned and began walking back toward her throne. "Any who take issue with this arrangement," she added without looking back, "may take their concerns up with me personally." No one in the hall seemed eager to do that. The normal noise and movement of the gathering slowly returned as aliens began talking amongst themselves once more. But everything had changed, and everyone knew it. Marcus stood in the middle of it all with a small alien princess holding his hand and wondered how his simple life of hauling cargo had led him to this moment. He looked down at Cathani, who looked back up at him with those galaxy-filled eyes. "So," he said quietly, "what do princesses like to do for fun?" She tilted her head in a way that reminded him oddly of a curious puppy. "Fun," she repeated as if testing the word. "What is fun?" Marcus felt something inside his chest tighten at the question. What kind of life had this child lived that she did not know what fun meant? "Well, kid," he said, and he squeezed her hand gently, "I guess I have a lot to teach you." The next 3 days of the Centennial Gathering were unlike anything in recorded galactic history, and Marcus Cole found himself at the center of all of it. Word had spread through the palace and beyond about what had happened in the Crystal Throne. All the human who had stood against the Dromulan ambassador, the princess who had chosen him as her protector, the queen who had allowed it to happen. Every species at the gathering wanted to know more about this strange turn of events, and the only way to learn more was to approach Captain Marcus Cole himself. But there was a problem with that plan. Princess Cathani had not left his side, even once since she had first grabbed his jacket, and anyone who wanted to speak with the heir to the Vethkari Empire had to go through her human guardian first. Marcus learned quickly how to read the little princess, and he discovered that she was better at judging character than any diplomat he had ever met. The Scytheran trade minister approached them on the second day with a smile that showed too many teeth and words that dripped with false sweetness. "Captain Cole, what a pleasure to finally speak with you," the minister said. "We have been watching your species with great interest, and we believe there are many investment opportunities that could benefit both our peoples." Marcus listened politely because he did not know enough to judge the offer on its own merits. But he noticed that Cathani's antennae had pressed flat against her head the moment the Scytheran had approached. "What do you think?" he asked her quietly. The princess shook her head slightly and pressed closer to his side. Marcus turned back to the trade minister with an apologetic expression. "We will have to decline," he said. "Maybe in another century or so." The Scytherans' false smile flickered for just a moment before returning. "Of course," the minister said through what sounded like clenched teeth. "Another time, perhaps." Later that same day, the Korvathi military attach found them in one of the palace gardens. The Korvathi were a warrior species, tall and muscular with scales that shifted color based on their mood, and they had a reputation for solving problems with violence first, and diplomacy never human. The attach said, and his scales had shifted to a dark red that Marcus suspected meant aggression. "I come to offer an alliance between our peoples. I am listening." Marcus replied carefully. "Your colonies in the outer systems are vulnerable." The attach continued. "We could provide protection in exchange for certain territorial adjustments that would benefit us both." Cathani made a small hissing sound, and Marcus felt her entire body tense with fear and disgust. "I do not think so," Marcus said, "but thank you for thinking of us." The attach's scales shifted to an even darker shade of red. "You would refuse the protection of the Korvathi Empire. I would refuse any deal that makes a child react the way she just did," Marcus replied, and his voice was steady, even though his heart was pounding. "I have found that children are rarely wrong about these things." The attach stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking away without another word. Ambassador Vorath tried to approach them twice during the Diaz gathering. The first time, Cathani saw him coming and pressed so close to Marcus that he could feel her small heart racing against his back. The second time, she simply refused to look at the Dromulan at all and turned her face away like he did not exist. "I believe," Marcus said loud enough for the nearby dignitaries to hear, "that the princess has made her feelings about your presence very clear, Ambassador." Vorath's gray face twisted with something that might have been hatred, but he could do nothing without causing an even larger incident. He walked away both times without getting what he wanted. On the evening of the second day, Queen Cirith then summoned Marcus to a private meeting while Cathani slept under the watchful eyes of the royal guards. They met on a balcony that overlooked the crystal gardens of the palace, where plants that glowed with inner light painted the night in shades of blue and violet and soft pink. "You have changed things," the queen said as they stood side by side, looking out at the beautiful view. "My daughter has changed things through you. I did not mean to cause any problems." Marcus began. "Do you know why children are sacred among my people, Captain?" Marcus shook his head. "Because they have not yet learned to lie," the queen explained, and her voice was softer than he had heard it before. "They cannot lie to themselves, and they cannot lie to others." She turned to face him, and the swirling galaxies in her eyes seemed to move faster. "Adults see threats, and we calculate responses." She continued. "We weigh advantages against disadvantages, and we play the long game of politics until we forget what truth looks like." Her antennae rose in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as emphasis. "Children see truth," she said. "My daughter looked at you, and she saw safety and protection and a being who would stand between her and harm without thinking about what it might cost. I just did what anyone would do." Marcus said. "No," the queen replied, and the word was sharp enough to cut. "You did what humans would do." She turned back to look at the gardens below. "I have watched your species since you first stumbled into the stars," she said. "You are young, and you are weak compared to most species in this galaxy, and you have no great fleets or ancient wisdom or empires that span the stars." Marcus waited because he could tell she was not finished. "But you protect your young," she said, and something in her voice had shifted to what might have been wonder. "Not just your own young, but any young creature you encounter." Her antennae moved in slow patterns as she spoke. "It is reflexive for your kind," she continued. "It is something built so deep into your nature that you do not even think about it." She turned to face him again. "I have seen reports of humans risking their lives for children of species that would rather eat them than thank them," she said. I have read about a human doctor who worked for 36 hours without rest to save a clutch of Velian eggs, and I have seen footage of a human soldier carrying a wounded Corvathi cub through enemy fire. Marcus thought about those stories and realized he was not surprised by any of them. Kids are kids. He said simply, "It does not matter what they look like." The Queen was silent for a long time after that. "I would propose an alliance, Captain Cole," she said finally. "Not between our empires, because that will require time and careful negotiation." "Then what kind of alliance?" "An alliance between my daughter and your kind." The Queen replied, "Education and exchange and understanding." Her dark eyes found his and held them. "When Cathani comes of age, she will rule an empire of 11 star systems and billions of lives," she said. "I would have her understand humanity. And I would have her remember the man who stood for her when no one else would." She extended one of her 4 hands with the palm facing up. "What say you, Captain?" she asked. "Will you help shape the future of this galaxy?" Marcus looked at her hand. He thought about his freighter waiting in orbit, and his crew who were probably wondering what had happened to him. He thought about his simple life of hauling cargo from one place to another. Then he thought about a small princess who had grabbed his jacket because something deep inside her had recognized him as safe. He thought about her question from earlier, about what fun meant and the life she must have lived to not know the answer. He reached out and took the Queen's hand. "I will do my best, Your Majesty," he said. "That," she replied, and something like a smile crossed her alien features, "is all any of us can do." 5 years had passed since the Centennial Gathering, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Captain Marcus Cole was no longer just a cargo hauler. He had been given the official title of Human Ambassador to the Vethkari Empire, and he split his time between Earth and Vethkar Prime, traveling back and forth so often that both places had started to feel like home princess. Cathani had grown in those 5 years. She was taller now, nearly 5 feet, and her shell had darkened from pale blue to a deeper shade that shimmered with hints of purple and green. But more importantly, she had changed on the inside. The frightened child, who had not known what fun meant, had become a curious and brave young princess who asked questions about everything and laughed easily at the jokes. Marcus told her even when they did not translate well. She called him her guardian in the formal Vethkari way, but in private she had started calling him something else, Uncle Marcus. The first time she had said it, Marcus had felt something warm bloom in his chest that he could not quite name. "Is that appropriate?" he had asked the Queen during one of their regular meetings. "For her to call me that." The Queen had tilted her head in that way she did when she was amused. "Among my people, family is not only about blood," she had replied. "It is about bonds that are chosen, and you and my daughter have chosen each other." She had paused, and her antennae had risen slightly. "Besides," she had added, "she calls you that because it is what she feels, and Vethkari children do not lie about their feelings." The exchange program that Marcus and the Queen had discussed on that balcony had grown beyond anything either of them had imagined. Human teachers came to Vethkar Prime to share their knowledge, and Vethkari scholars traveled to Earth to study at human universities. Young Vethkari learned about human art and music and literature, and young humans learned about Vethkari history and science and philosophy. It was working that 2 species were beginning to understand each other in ways that went beyond simple diplomacy, but not everyone was happy about these changes. The Dromulan hegemony had been watching the growing friendship between humanity and the Vethkari Empire with increasing concern. Master Morath had returned to his homeworld in disgrace after the incident at the gathering, and he had spent the years since then nursing his wounded pride and planning his revenge. He found allies among other species who feared what a human and Vethkari alliance might mean for the balance of power in the galaxy. The Corvathi were easy to convince because they had never forgiven Marcus for refusing their offer. of protection, the Scytherans joined because they saw profit in chaos and war together. They formed a coalition that they called the Preservation Alliance, and they began to prepare for a conflict that they hoped would destroy the friendship between humans and Vethkari. Before it could grow any stronger, Marcus learned about the threat during a visit to Earth when a young intelligence officer pulled him aside after a diplomatic reception. "Ambassador Cole, we have intercepted communications that suggest the Romulans are planning something big," the officer said. "They are talking about striking at the heart of the exchange program." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, and the officer's face was grim. "We think they are planning to attack the cultural center on Vethkar Prime," she said. "The one where the human and Vethkari students study together." Marcus felt cold fear grip his heart because he knew that Princess Kethani visited that cultural center every week. She loved talking to the human students and learning about their customs, and she had made friends there that she talked about constantly. "When?" Marcus demanded. "We are not sure," the officer admitted. But soon, Marcus did not wait for official channels or diplomatic protocols. Contacted the Queen directly using the private communication channel she had given him years ago. "Your Majesty, I have urgent news," he said when her image appeared on his screen. The Queen listened to everything he had to say, and her expression grew darker with each word. "This is an act of war," she said when he had finished. "The Romulans would not dare unless they had strong allies. They have the Kovathi and the Scytherans." Marcus replied, "Maybe others. Then we must be prepared." The Queen said, "Return to Vethkara Prime immediately, Ambassador, and bring whatever forces Earth can spare." Marcus nodded and ended the communication he had spent 5 years building. Bridges between two species, and now someone was trying to burn those bridges down. He thought about Kethani and the bright, curious young princess she had become. He thought about the human students at the cultural center who had traveled across the stars to learn about another species. He thought about what it would mean if the Romulans succeeded in destroying everything they had built. "Not on my watch," he said to himself as he began making calls to gather what forces he could. Earth's military was small compared to the great powers of the galaxy, but they were fierce and determined. And they had something that many other species did not have. They had something worth fighting for. Next few weeks were a blur of activity as both humans and Vethkari prepared for the coming storm ships. Were moved into defensive positions around Vethkar Prime. Soldiers were stationed at key locations throughout the planet. The cultural center was quietly evacuated, and the students were moved to safer locations. Deeper within Vethkari territory, Kethani had wanted to stay and help, but her mother had forbidden it. "You are the heir to this empire," the Queen had said firmly. "Your safety is not yours to risk." The princess had argued and protested, but in the end she had obeyed. Before she left, she had found Marcus in the command center where he was coordinating the defensive efforts. "Uncle Marcus," she had said, and her voice was small in a way it had not been for years. "Will you be safe?" Marcus had knelt down so he could look her in the eyes. "I will do my best, kid," he had said. "That is not a promise." She had replied, "No," he had admitted. "It is not." She had thrown her arms around him then and held him tight with all 4 of her hands. "You are not allowed to die," she had whispered. "I still need you." Marcus had hugged her back and tried not to let her see the tears in his eyes. "I will do everything I can to come back to you," he had said. "That is the best promise I can make." She had pulled back and looked at him with those galaxy-filled eyes that had grown so much older and wiser in the past 5 years. "Then I will hold you to it," she had said, and then she was gone. Escorted away to safety by a full squad of royal guards, Marcus watched her go and felt the weight of his promise settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He turned back to the tactical displays that showed enemy ships gathering at the edge of Vethkari space. The storm was coming, and he intended to weather it. 20 years had passed since a cargo hauler named Marcus Cole had stood in the Crystal Throne Hall and changed the course of galactic history. The war with the Preservation Alliance had been brutal but sure. The Dromulans had underestimated both humanity's determination and the depth of the bond between humans and Vethkari when the enemy fleet had attacked. They had expected to face two separate forces that would struggle to coordinate with each other. Instead, they had found a unified defense that fought together like a single organism on ships, had darted through the battle using their smaller size and greater speed to disrupt enemy formations, while Vethkari warships had delivered devastating strikes against the confused and scattered attackers. The battle had lasted 3 days, and when it was over, the Preservation Alliance was broken ambassador. Vareth had been captured alive and had spent the rest of his life in a Vethkari prison, thinking about the mistakes that had led him there. The victory had proven to the galaxy that the alliance between humans and Vethkari was not a passing fancy, but something real and powerful and worth respecting. In the years that followed, more species had begun to seek friendships with humanity. They had seen what humans could do when they fought for something they believed in, and they had recognized this young species had something valuable to offer the galaxy. Queen Sarithvan had ruled for another 15 years before passing peacefully. In her sleep, Marcus had been at her side in those final hours, along with her daughter, who had held both of their hands as her mother slipped away. "Take care of her," the queen had whispered to Marcus with her final breath. "As you always have, I will." Marcus had promised. Now Empress Cathani of the Vethkari Empire stood before the Galactic Concordat to announce the most significant interstellar alliance in 10,000 years of recorded history. The Terran and Vethkari Compact would bind humanity and the Vethkari together as partners and equals and friends. The speech was broadcast across 1,000 worlds, and billions of beings watched as the young Empress spoke. "When I was young," she said, and her voice carried the same harmonic complexity as her mother's had, but touched with something warmer and more human. "I was afraid." The assembled dignitaries listened in silence as she continued. "I was afraid of the powerful beings who surrounded me, and afraid of my own weakness, and afraid that I would never be strong enough to protect those who would one day depend on me." She paused, and her dark eyes swept across the great hall. "In that moment of fear, I sought shelter," she said, "not from my mother, who loved me, but whose duty required her to watch me struggle." Her antennae rose as she continued, "Not from the guards who could protect my body, but not my spirit." She turned slightly, and her gaze found someone in the front row of the audience. "I sought shelter behind a human." Footage from that day 20 years ago played on screens throughout the hall, showing a small, frightened princess running to hide behind a confused-looking man in a formal jacket that did not fit quite right. "Captain Marcus Cole did not know me," the Empress continued. "He had no reason to help me, and intervening could have caused problems that would have hurt his entire species." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, but he did not calculate advantages or weigh risks against benefits. She said, "He simply saw a frightened child and decided to help." In the front row, Admiral Marcus Cole of the United Earth Defense Force sat in his dress uniform, with his hair gray now, but his posture still straight and strong. Beside him sat his wife, a human scientist who studied alien languages, and their 3 children who had grown up calling a Vethkari Empress their Aunt Kath. "Humanity is young," the Empress continued. "They have no ancient fleets that have conquered the stars, and no empires that stretch across dozens of systems, and no legacy of power that reaches back thousands of years." She spread all 4 of her arms wide. "But they have something that we in our age and wisdom have forgotten," she declared. Her voice rose to fill the entire hall. "They remember why we build empires in the first place," she said. "Not for glory and not for dominance, but to create safe places where children can grow without fear." She took a step forward, and her presence seemed to expand to fill the room, to build shelters against the darkness. She continued, "To stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, She paused and let her words sink in. The Vethkari conquered 11 star systems to prove our strength. She said, humanity has shown us a different kind of strength. Her voice softened slightly, but still carried to every corner of the hall. The strength to protect without expecting anything in return. She said, the strength to shield without thinking about what it might cost them. She looked directly at Marcus, and 20 years of shared history passed between them in that moment. The strength to look upon a child of any species and say you are safe with me. She stepped back from the podium and raised her head high. This compact is my answer to that lesson. She declared, the Vethkari Empire pledges to stand with humanity not because they are strong, but because they have shown us what strength should be used for. The hall erupted into chaos as different species reacted in different ways. Some applauded, and some protested, and all of them were forced to think about what this new alliance would mean for the future of the galaxy. In the front row, Admiral Cole felt a small hand slip into his ease. He looked down to see his youngest daughter looking up at him with curious eyes. Dad, she asked, did you really make the Empress hide behind you when she was little? Marcus laughed, and the sound cut through the noise around them. Warm and human and completely unbothered by the weight of history. No, sweetheart, he said, and squeezed her hand gently. She chose to hide behind me, and I just did not move. Above them, on the stage, Empress Cathani caught his eye across the crowded hall. Her antennae rose in greeting, and something passed between them without words, a memory of a frightened child and a cargo captain who had accidentally changed the course of galactic history by doing the most human thing possible. He had simply helped. After the ceremony, the Empress found Marcus in a quiet corner of the palace gardens. They stood together in the soft glow of the bioluminescent plants, just as Marcus had once stood with her mother in this same spot. 20 years. Cathani said softly, 20 years. Marcus agreed. She turned to face him, and he saw the child she had been reflected in the Empress she had become. Thank you, Uncle Marcus, she said, for everything. Marcus smiled and reached out to take her hand, just as he had done on that day so long ago. Thank you, kid, he replied, for choosing me. They stood together in comfortable silence as the sounds of celebration drifted through the night air. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was growing, and the future stretched out before them, full of possibility. And promised it had all started with a single moment of kindness. A cargo captain who had seen a frightened child and had decided to help. That was the human way, and now because of it, the stars themselves would never be the same. The end.